My name is Catherine, and at 33 years old, I've spent my career preserving history. As an archivist, my job is to protect the truth from being eroded by time or rewritten by convenience. But 3 months ago, at the memorial service for my husband, Matthew, I learned that the most dangerous revisions don't happen in history books, they happen in your own family. The service was held in the Grand Hall of the Georgetown Historical Society, a venue Matthew would have hated for its opulence but tolerated for its acoustics. The room was filled with D.C. quiet elite judges, forensic accountants, and the kind of people who understand that power is often silent. I had just stepped up to the podium, my hands gripping the polished wood, ready to deliver a eulogy about Matthew's integrity, about his relentless pursuit of financial truth, and then, my sister stood up. Chloe didn't just interrupt, she performed. Dressed in black lace that was more cocktail party than funeral, she walked down the center aisle carrying her 1-year-old son, Jacob. The room went silent, the kind of silence that feels like the air has been sucked out of the space. She walked right up to the altar, past me, and placed Jacob directly next to Matthew's framed portrait. The resemblance was non-existent, but the audacity was undeniable. "I can't let him be buried with a lie," she announced, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "Matthew wasn't just my brother-in-law, he was Jacob's father, and this boy is the only rightful heir to his estate." I froze, staring at the baby on the altar. If you've ever had a family member use a funeral or a sacred moment to launch a personal attack, drop a yes in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. I need to know I'm not the only one who has survived this kind of madness. Most people would have screamed. Most people would have dragged her off the stage or collapsed in tears. But I am not most people, and I was married to a man who taught me that emotion is just bad data in an audit. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I looked at Chloe, then at the baby, and then at my parents in the front row, who were looking everywhere but at me. And in that moment, the grief didn't vanish, but it crystallized into something cold and sharp. This wasn't a family tragedy. It was a transaction. And I was about to close the account. I stepped back from the podium, signaled security to gently escort Chloe out. She went willingly, sobbing for the cameras, and finished the service. I didn't mention her outburst. I didn't dignify it with a response. I treated it like an error in a ledger, noted, flagged, and set aside for correction. Later that evening, back in the silence of our restored townhouse in Georgetown, I allowed myself to think, not to feel, but to think. Matthew and I were a power couple of introverts. He hunted corporate fraud for a living. I hunted lost historical narratives. We understood that the truth is rarely loud. It's buried in footnotes, in deleted files, in the discrepancy between public image and private reality. Chloe, on the other hand, lived her life in the spotlight. At 29, she was a lifestyle influencer whose brand was effortless luxury, funded entirely by debt and family bailouts. She owed $185,000 in credit card debt, a fact I knew because Matthew had secretly restructured her loans twice to keep our parents from bankruptcy. My parents, Patricia and Ronald, were obsessed with status. They lived in a world where appearance was currency, and they had spent their retirement renting a lifestyle they couldn't afford. For years, Matthew and I had been the invisible bank. We paid the mortgage on their estate in Virginia. We covered Chloe's business expenses. We were the safety net they resented, because we came with conditions, receipts, budgets, accountability. They hated us for it. They hated that we saw the math behind the magic. And now, with Matthew gone, they saw an opening. They didn't see a grieving widow. They saw a vulnerable vault. I walked through the empty house, touching the spine of the first edition books Matthew collected. Our marriage hadn't just been a romance. It was a partnership of absolute truth. We had made a decision years ago about children. It was a private, medical, and personal choice that we had kept to ourselves, shielding it from my parents' prying questions about legacy. That decision was our secret garden, a place of peace we defended against the world. Chloe's lie wasn't just a grab for the $2,400,000 estate. It was a violation of our most intimate truth. She was rewriting our history to serve her future. She was claiming that Matthew, the most loyal, ethical man I had ever known, had betrayed me with my own sister. It was biologically, emotionally, and factually impossible. But in the court of public opinion, and in the Shark Tank of D.C. gossip, the truth doesn't matter as much as the scandal, unless you have the receipts. And I knew exactly where to find them. The doorbell rang at 8 a.m. sharp. I didn't need to check the security camera to know who it was. My parents, Patricia and Ronald, operated on a schedule dictated by appearances, and a family crisis was just another event to be managed before brunch. I opened the door to my townhouse. They swept in without a word, bypassing me to stand in the center of the foyer. My mother was wearing her signature pearls, the ones Matthew had paid to have restrung last year. My father wore his country club blazer, though his membership dues were 3 months in arrears, another bill Matthew had quietly intercepted. They didn't look like grieving grandparents or concerned parents. They looked like lobbyists arriving for a closed-door negotiation. "We need to settle this," my father said, turning to face me. "Before the press gets wind of it, the Post is already sniffing around the Historical Society." "Settle what?" I asked, leaning against the banister. "The fact that Chloe committed estate fraud in front of half the Senate?" "Don't use legal terms, Catherine. It's unbecoming," my mother snapped. She paced the hallway, her heels clicking on the marble, a sound that used to make me flinch but now just sounded like a ticking clock. "Chloe is emotional. She made a mistake, but now that it's out there, we have to manage the narrative." "Manage the narrative," I repeated. "By admitting it's a lie?" They exchanged a look. It was a look I had seen 1,000 times, growing up, the silent agreement to rewrite reality to suit their comfort. This was the triangulation. The two of them united against the one person who refused to play along. "Catherine," my father said, his voice dropping to that reasonable paternal tone he used when asking for money. "Think about Matthew's legacy. If we deny this, it becomes a scandal. A paternity suit. Mudslinging. Is that what you want for him? But if we accept it," my mother interjected, smoothing her skirt, "if we embrace Jacob as family, the story becomes about redemption. About generosity. We keep the money in the family. We protect the name." "The money," I said. "You mean the $2 million life insurance policy?" "It's just paper," my father waved a hand dismissively. "But the family name? That's forever." I looked at them, really looked at them, and for the first time, the anger didn't feel hot, it felt cold and clinical. I realized I was looking at the illusion of power from an empty wallet. Society tells us that wealth and status are solid things, like foundation stones. But looking at Patricia and Ronald, I saw the physics of their existence. They were a vacuum. Their entire identity, the club memberships, the charity galas, the estate in Virginia, was a hollow shell held up by debt and delusion. They weren't powerful, they were desperate. They had spent 40 years buying things they couldn't afford to impress people they didn't like. And now, with their financier dead, the bill was coming due. They didn't care about Matthew's legacy. They didn't care about Jacob. They cared that without that insurance payout, the vacuum would implode. They were terrified. And terror makes people cannibals. They were willing to consume their own daughter's dignity, to keep the lights on in a life that was already dark. "You need the money," I stated. It wasn't a question. "We have some liquidity issues," my father admitted, refusing to meet my eyes. "The market has been unkind." "Matthew covered your liquidity issues," I said. "And now you want me to cover them by admitting to a lie that defiles his memory." "It's not a lie if we all agree to it," my mother whispered. "That's how history works, isn't it, Catherine? You of all people should know that. The truth is just what survives." That was the mistake. She tried to use my profession against me. She thought archiving was about erasing the inconvenient parts. She didn't understand that an archivist's true job is to preserve the stains, the redactions, and the evidence of the crime. "You're right," I said, pushing off the banister. "The truth is what survives, and I'm going to make sure it does." "Does that mean you'll sign?" my father asked, hope making him look pathetic. "It means you should leave," I said. "Because I have work to do." They left, confident that their pressure had worked, satisfied that they had rattled the quiet daughter. They didn't see the shift in the atmosphere. They didn't realize that by threatening Matthew's name, they hadn't cornered a victim. They had activated a witness. I locked the door. The house was silent again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of answers. I walked straight to Matthew's home office. He had built a career catching people who thought they could edit the numbers. He knew that eventually, everyone leaves a trail. And my parents just left muddy footprints all over the crime scene. I crossed the threshold into the one room in the house that Patricia and Ronald had never dared to enter. Matthew's home office. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper, the scent of preservation. This was my sanctuary. But it was Matthew's command center. While I preserved the past, Matthew dissected the present. He was a forensic accountant who specialized in high-level corporate fraud. He didn't just look at numbers, he looked at the behavior behind them. He often told me that every crime leaves a digital fingerprint, and every liar eventually creates a ledger they can't balance. I sat in his ergonomic chair, the leather still molded to his shape. I didn't let myself cry. Crying obscures vision, and I needed to see clearly. I reached out and woke his primary workstation. 3 monitors hummed to life, bathing the room in a soft, blue glow. Most widows look for sentimental photos or old emails. I was looking for a weapon. Matthew had a contingency plan for everything. He called it the Guardian Protocol. It was a digital dead man's switch designed for his most dangerous cases, a way to ensure that if he was ever silenced, the evidence he collected would still find its way to the authorities. But 6 months ago, he had added a personal partition. At the time, I thought he was being paranoid. He called it insurance. I placed my hand on the biometric scanner. A green light swept across my palm. The screen shifted from a standard desktop to a secure, encrypted interface. A single prompt appeared in the center of the black screen. Enter inquiry parameters. I didn't type a date. I typed a name. Patricia. Then I added a second search term, one that my father had used just minutes ago in the hallway. Liquidity. The system processed for a fraction of a second before a cascade of files flooded the screen. Bank transfers, email intercepts, credit reports. It was a forensic map of my parents' financial destruction. I saw the second mortgages, the maxed-out lines of credit, the desperate loans from predatory lenders. My father wasn't just having market issues, he was insolvent. He had been insolvent for 5 years. But that wasn't the twist. Matthew knew all of that. We both did. I cleared the screen and typed the final, most painful keyword. The one that had started this entire war. Chloe. The screen blinked. A red folder appeared. It wasn't just a file, it was a comprehensive dossier. The label read, The Chloe Ledger. Status, active surveillance. My breath caught in my throat. Matthew hadn't just been paying their bills, he had been building a case. He knew. He had known for a long time that my family wasn't just a drain on our resources. They were a threat to our security. I opened the folder. It was organized with the terrifying precision of a man who knew he might not be there to explain it himself. Subfolders were labeled by year, then by offense type. Unauthorized access attempts, forged signatures, identity theft indicators. He had been tracking them. He had been tracking Ryan, the failed musician in Baltimore who Chloe claimed to have cut off years ago. He had been tracking the hush money payments my mother had been funneling to him from the account Matthew replenished for house repairs. I realized then that I wasn't alone in this room. Matthew was here. He had fought this battle in silence for years, absorbing the blows, shielding me from the worst of their depravity so I could focus on my history books. He hadn't just left me money, he had left me the truth. I clicked on the most recent subfolder, dated just 2 weeks before his death. Inside was a single, encrypted file, labeled Biological Impossibility Protocol. I stared at the screen, my hand hovering over the mouse. They thought they were playing checkers with a grieving widow. They didn't realize they were playing chess with a grandmaster who had already made his move from the grave. I double-clicked the file. The file opened, and the truth flooded the screen in high-definition monochrome. It wasn't a sentimental letter or a video diary, it was a timeline. Matthew had constructed a chronological forensic audit of our entire family history, and the first document was the kill shot. Exhibit A, Medical Records, St. Jude's Medical Center, Urology Department. Date, 3 years ago. Procedure, bilateral vasectomy. Surgeon's note, procedure successful, 0 motility confirmed in follow-up. I stared at the scanned document. We had made that choice together, quietly, on a Tuesday morning. We decided that our legacy wouldn't be biological. It would be professional. We wanted to leave behind truth, not heirs. We never told my parents because we knew they would weaponize it, calling us selfish for denying them grandchildren. Now, that silence was our greatest weapon. Matthew had preserved the receipt. Jacob was 1 year old. Matthew had been sterile for 3. The math wasn't just bad, it was impossible. But Matthew didn't stop there. He knew that proving a negative wasn't enough, he had to prove the positive. I scrolled down to Exhibit B. The Ryan Protocol. There were bank statements from my mother's emergency account, the one she thought was secret. For the past 18 months, she had been wiring $2,000 a month to a consultant in Baltimore named Ryan Miller. I knew that name. Ryan was the failed musician Chloe had dated briefly 2 years ago. She had sworn he disappeared when she got pregnant, claiming the father was a venture capitalist who wanted anonymity. My mother had spun the story that Ryan was a deadbeat. The ledger told a different story. My mother wasn't paying him to stay away, she was paying him for his silence. There were emails intercepted from Patricia's account. Subject: this month's installment. Body: stay in Baltimore. If you contact her, the money stops. We are handling the situation. They knew. My parents knew Jacob was Ryan's son. They knew Chloe was broke. They knew the only way to save their social standing was to erase the struggling musician and replace him with the wealthy, deceased brother-in-law. They weren't just protecting Chloe. They were curating a pedigree for the baby that would unlock the insurance payout. Finally, I opened Exhibit C. The forgery analysis. Matthew had even analyzed the codicil Chloe had flashed at the funeral. He must have seen a draft she left on a shared cloud drive. Or perhaps he just anticipated her methods. He had overlaid the signature on the will with a digital scan of a birthday card he'd given her 5 years ago. It was a perfect match. Every loop, every hesitation mark. She hadn't just forged his signature. She had traced it. It was a copy-paste job. In the world of forensics, it was lazy. In the eyes of the law, it was a felony. I sat back, the glow of the monitors illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I didn't feel the heat of anger anymore. I felt the cold clarity of a judge passing a sentence. They had turned my husband's memory into a prop for their con. They had turned an innocent child into a pawn. And they had underestimated the woman who kept the records. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer, a man named George, who had been Matthew's golf partner and legal shark. "Catherine?" he answered on the first ring. "Is everything all right?" "No, George," I said, my voice steady. "But it's about to be. I need you to set up a meeting. Invite my parents, Chloe, and their legal counsel." "What's the agenda?" "Tell them I'm ready to sign," I lied. "Tell them I'm ready to acknowledge the heir." I hung up. It was time to close the book on this family, but first, I was going to make them read the footnotes. The meeting took place in the conference room of George's firm, a space dominated by mahogany and silence. My parents arrived first, Patricia wearing a somber expression that barely concealed her triumph. Ronald looked almost bored, checking his watch as if waiting for a wire transfer to clear. Then Chloe made her entrance. She was dressed in severe black, a veil netting her face like a widow from a 1940s noir film. It was a performance piece. She sat down, dabbing dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, looking every inch the grieving mother of the secret heir. "Let's make this quick," my father said, drumming his fingers on the table. "Catherine needs to sign the acknowledgement of paternity, so we can release the insurance funds. We all want to move on." "I agree," I said. My voice was level, devoid of the tremor they were expecting. "We should move on. But first, we need to review the addendum." "What addendum?" Chloe snapped, her voice losing its breathy grief for a split second. "The one Matthew prepared," I said. I pressed a button on the remote in my hand. The projector screen descended from the ceiling. The lights dimmed automatically. Matthew was a forensic accountant, I reminded them. He didn't believe in unverified assets. The first slide appeared, the urology report. The room went dead still. The projected image was massive, the text undeniable. Bilateral vasectomy. Zero motility. The date was highlighted in red 2 years before Jacob was conceived. "Biologically impossible," I stated. "Unless you're suggesting a miracle, Chloe," Chloe's face went from pale to gray. She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. I clicked the remote. The second slide. The Ryan protocol. Bank statements filled the screen. My mother's secret account. The wire transfers to Baltimore. The emails she had sent to Ryan. The musician. Buying his silence. You knew, I said, looking directly at my parents. You knew Jacob wasn't Matthew's. You knew he was Ryan's. But a struggling musician doesn't come with a $2 million payout, does he? My father slumped in his chair, the air leaving him like a punctured tire. My mother looked at the screen, then at me, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with exposure. I clicked one last time. The forgery analysis. The digital overlay of the signature. The match was exact. A felony projected in high definition. And then, it happened. The moment I had been waiting for. I watched Chloe. A normal person, caught in a lie this devastating, would collapse. They would cry. They would beg for forgiveness. But Chloe didn't cry. Her face contorted, twisting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. You bitch, she screamed, slamming her hands on the table. You jealous, barren bitch. You did this to humiliate me. You couldn't just let me have this? You have everything, and you couldn't let me have this one thing? This was the narcissistic injury. When you expose a narcissist, they don't feel guilt. They don't feel remorse for the harm they've done. They feel victimized by the truth. In her mind, I wasn't the victim of her fraud. She was the victim of my competence. She didn't care that she had defiled a dead man's memory. She cared that I had ruined her scene. It's not about what you have, Chloe, I said, standing up. It's about what you stole. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table. Matthew's protocol is active, I said. If I don't enter a cancellation code in 5 minutes, this entire presentation, the vasectomy, the hush money, the forgery, will be emailed to every member of the Historical Society, the D.C. Social Register, and the District Attorney's Fraud Division. You wouldn't, my mother whispered. I am my husband's wife, I said. Try me. They signed. It took less than 3 minutes. My father's hand shook so badly he could barely hold the pen, but the threat of the email blast, the threat of total social annihilation in Georgetown, was a motivator more powerful than any moral compass. They signed the acknowledgement of paternity for Ryan. They signed the release of claims on the estate. They signed non-disclosure agreements that I had George draft that morning, ensuring that if they ever spoke my name in public again, the Guardian Protocol would reactivate and finish what we started in that conference room. The fallout was mathematical. It followed the laws of cause and effect with brutal precision. The insurance company didn't just deny Chloe's claim, they opened a fraud investigation. When you try to steal $2 million from an insurer, they don't just say no, they prosecute. Chloe didn't go to jail, but she lost something she valued more than her freedom. Her platform. Her sponsors dropped her. Her effortless luxury brand evaporated when the liens hit her bank accounts. She moved back in with my parents, into a house that was already in foreclosure. As for Patricia and Ronald, their liquidity issues became a tsunami. Without Matthew's invisible hand steadying their finances, the creditors swarmed. The townhouse in Virginia was listed for a short sale. The country club memberships were revoked. They weren't destroyed by a scandal, they were destroyed by the truth of their own insolvency. They simply ceased to matter to the people they had spent a lifetime trying to impress. I didn't watch it happen. I didn't track their downfall. I simply stopped paying the bills. I changed the locks on my townhouse, changed my phone number, and deleted them from my life. It wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of sanitation. 2 weeks later, the insurance payout hit my account. $2,400,000. Most people would have bought a vacation home or taken a trip around the world to heal. But I knew that wouldn't honor Matthew. He didn't accumulate wealth for luxury. He used it for leverage. I sat in his office, looking at the empty chair, and I realized that true justice isn't about punishment. Punishment is backward-looking. True justice is about planting a seed that grows over the grave of the lie. I initiated a wire transfer. I didn't keep the money. I used every cent, to establish the Matthew Vance Forensic Truth Scholarship. It provides full rides to archivists and forensic accountants dedicated to exposing corporate and estate fraud. It funds the kind of people who look at a ledger and see a crime scene. It funds the people who protect the truth. This morning, I stood in the small garden behind our townhouse. The noise of DC felt distant. The air was crisp. For the first time in 3 months, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt clean. I looked at the spot where I had scattered Matthew's ashes, right beneath the oak tree he loved. They tried to steal his legacy to pay for their lies. Instead, his legacy is now an army of truth seekers who will ensure that other liars, in other rooms, eventually face their own ledgers. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold air. The account was closed, the balance was zero, and I was finally free. Sometimes, the people who claim to love you are the ones holding the knife. But the truth? The truth is a shield they can never break. If you're fighting a battle for your own truth right now, type, "I am the architect" in the comments. Let's build something they can't destroy. Don't forget to follow for more stories from the files.